So thank you all, everyone, for joining us here for Ann Arbor for Public Power's Roundtable, Making a Muni, Pathways, Pitfalls, and Possibilities, Part 2, Where Will We Find the Power? I've got three fantastic panelists here with me tonight that I'm going to allow to introduce themselves here in just a moment. But before we begin, I want to just go through a bit of the format of tonight's roundtable. So we will begin with a set of, with allowing all of our panelists to introduce themselves. We will then move into some prepared questions that we within Ann Arbor for Public Power have prepared and sent over to the speakers. And then we'll be moving into a Q&A section, and we'll be looking to all of you to please provide us some fantastic questions so that we can really take advantage of their knowledge. And we will go ahead and kick it off with Brandy. Brandy, you should be able to turn your video on now. Could you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thank you. Hi, Greg. My name is Brandy Akron. I'm the Executive Director of Traverse City Light and Power, which is a municipal utility in Northwest Michigan.
Fantastic. And Matthew?
Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Kaysen. I am the campaign coordinator for Democratize ComEd, a public power campaign in the city of Chicago.
Awesome. And finally, George.
I'm George Stojic. I was on the staff of the Michigan Public Service Commission for 30 years and the Lansing Board of Water and Light for 11 years as the Executive Director of Planning and Development. Currently, I am the owner and only employee of Red Cedar Energy.
So to kick it off for tonight, I want to go into a bit of a prepared question. And we'll start it off with Brandy. Brandy, just to kind of kick this whole thing off, with your experience as an executive director of an existing muni that has been around for about 100 years, one of the most recently created in Michigan, however, still quite old at this point. If you were to create a muni nowadays, how would you do it? How would you structure a newly created municipal utility?
So the structure that I would think that's probably the most beneficial allows you to leverage the value of being able to work still as an autonomous utility while still leveraging your partnership with the community that you serve, the utility, or like the city, municipality. So being able to have a separate utility board that still works in cohesion with the city council or city commission, whichever it may be for your particular municipality. And then also being able to ensure that the utility has full operational authority to manage its assets, its people, its operations, so that it can kind of operate and run differently and not really be kind of having to balance some of the traditional, I would say, tasks that most municipal groups have to deal with in terms of like city council members having to be worried about re-election every so often and things like that. So being able to structure it so that you are still functioning autonomously as your own, but also being able to kind of leverage the value of being, local.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brandy. And now, Matthew, you have spent some time organizing, much like we have been, on creating a public power utility. I'm curious, what is it exactly that motivated you to start going down the path of trying to create a municipal utility like Brandy and George have experienced running?
Yeah, it was a mix of factors. Part of it was just simple timing. Our franchise agreement expired in 2020. And for anyone who's been involved in the politics of public power, especially trying to form a municipal utility, those tend to be major political moments when you can actually push forward this type of campaign and win these type of victories. We've seen similar type of things happen in Minnesota, Boulder, elsewhere as well. But another reason was the organization that founded this campaign, the Democratic Socialists of America, had an ideological kind of orientation towards this campaign. The idea of public power fit well with our kind of leftist socialist idea of government and public goods, government services, and the ability to really bring what is currently a private good into public ownership and public control to make it work for the people. And in particular, we are particularly motivated by our climate goals to decarbonize the city, address climate change, but also address kind of more downstream issues like low-income assistance, union labor, those type of things as well. And municipal power, public power broadly, really just fit all those kind of ideological and like material and operational goals we had into a really nice and efficient package to drive transformation for the city of Chicago.
Fantastic. And did you feel like climate was a bit of a factor for you when you were pursuing municipalization?
Oh, definitely. It, both speaking for our own campaign of a lot of our own members' kind of motivations, climate's a big factor for us. The climate change, big deal. IPCC reports. I'm sure many of us here have read them and are familiar with the details. But we think for me personally, it's decarbonization is really going to define the future of our world and economy. And public power, I think, is really like one of the most important ways to achieve that. It saves money, it's more effective, it can really drive the initiative in a way that's difficult to do through investor-owned utilities, as anyone who's ever worked with them can probably understand. It also really brings and centers the fight in the public consciousness in a way that more esoteric issues of like environmental regulation or power purchase agreements or renewable energy standards doesn't quite do. And ultimately, to kind of do all the climate change policy changes that we're going to need, you really do need that kind of central public campaign and public focus to really drive those changes. And public power, at least at the local level or the state level, is a really great way of doing that, in my opinion.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matthew. And that kind of leads well into my question for George. George, Matthew just mentioned public power purchase agreements. Sorry there. What is a power purchase agreement? How do they work for a municipal utility? And are they a tool that a municipal utility could use to help reach its climate goals?
Absolutely. So a power purchase agreement is just that, it's an agreement or a contract between a utility and a third-party supplier of power. And a third-party supplier could be a project developer, developing a new project for the utility. Could be a supplier that might have a portfolio of different types of resources, different types of projects that they bring to the table. And the agreement is just lays out the terms and conditions of the service, what will be delivered, how will it be paid for, the rights and responsibilities of the various parties. It's been attractive to public utilities or municipal utilities for a couple of reasons. And one is that, especially if you're interested in renewable energy, wind or solar, something along those lines, there have been tax credits available for that, right? And the tax credits, either as an investment tax credit or production tax credit, is worth up to 30% of the investment cost of those projects. So munis are not tax entities. So in order to harvest that benefit, you can do that through a power agreement. You used to do that, and you still can do that through a purchase power agreement, where a developer who does have a tax liability will share some of that benefit and lower the cost. So there's been that benefit through PPAs. The second, building big projects is something small utilities don't do all the time. Big generating projects, there's a lot of risk, there's a lot of capital involved in that. There are people that specialize that and do a great job with it. So another reason to do that PPA. Third reason, there are economies of scale. You can go together with other municipalities, organizations to get a larger effect that lowers the cost of the outcome of those projects. For a utility like the Lansing Board of Water and Light, or if Ann Arbor had one, or any other small municipal utility, if you want to do a large renewable project somewhere, and you do the utility larger scale projects to lower the cost of the power. To do one, they're usually remote. You can't really do one within your city itself. So now you've got to figure out how to operate it, how to maintain it, and so forth. And there are people that specialize in that, so it's easier to do through a purchase power agreement. The only other thing I would say, will let you a little bit on what goes into those. So if you're thinking about purchase power agreements, usually there's a term on them. They usually go 15 to 5 years. I think most of ours, when we're at the Board of Water and Light, about 20 years. Brandy, do you recall 20, 25 years? And usually they have a rollover, so you can maybe do another 5 years at the end of the period. One of the benefits of them are that prices are pretty stable. The terms and conditions of the purchase power agreement will specify the price. The price will either be same every year or it'll be increasing price. So one comes to mind to me, a solar project that had a levelized price of maybe $42 or $43 megawatt hour as one option, or the other option is you can start at $37 or $38 a megawatt hour, go up to $47, $48 in the final years, but the price is known ahead of time. The last thing I'd say about a purchase power agreement is this. It has been getting harder to renewable projects in Michigan. And that's at least due in part to the sort of the balkanized nature of the permitting that takes place at the local level. And there has been a number of projects, mostly wind, but we're starting to pick up on the projects as well. So somebody's got to take the risk of actually securing the property, getting the permits and doing the building, and having somebody that has some expertise that helps as well, which you can get the purchase power agreement. So yeah, I think they're full. If it's not something you do all the time, which building large spaces use that what munis do, then you either have to go together with somebody else and do it through a purchase power agreement or some other way.
Makes a lot of sense. Thanks, George. And that kind of leads into the next question that I have here for Brandy. Geez, apologies. So generally thinking, beyond just power purchase agreements, what are some strategies that munis can use to help lower their carbon emissions, lower bills, or otherwise benefit their communities?
So I'll focus on like one of the values of public power and public ownership is the fact that you can plan and strategize based on a smaller footprint, a constituent group. So usually it's the needs of the community, as opposed to spread across either the whole state or a couple states, so to speak. And so that's one of the inherent values that you have as a municipal utility. So you can being able to kind of leverage that relationship, that customization, and really being able to kind of focus and know what does your particular group, your customer base, what do they need to know? What do they need to be aware of? And being localized, you're a little closer to that than you would if you were, having a larger rate base that you're somewhat serving. So when it comes to being able to implement some strategies that are focused on planet health goals, carbon emission, renewables, one of the key pieces is being able to offer your customers an opportunity to buy in and participate. George mentioned those PPAs that we acquire, but being able to maybe give our customers an opportunity to participate in the purchase of that in some fashion or form. Sometimes they really enjoy it because they want to make the investment. Others at times want to be able to site their own renewables on either their home or their business, and being able to work with them on how to integrate and interconnect them with an agreement is one strategy to kind of help both work on yourself and then also work on, low carbon emissions within that particular footprint, or allow customers to really do their part. They want to get involved and do their part. So that's like one of the major ways. The other piece, I know we kind of talked about this a little bit, is because of the price that's associated with some of these big projects, being able to enable the customer to do that with on-bill financing. We do on-bill financing here. We utilize a third party to kind of help us with that. But it really does offer up a lot of options for customers so that those type of renewable endeavors, or energy efficiency endeavors rather, which kind of help with waste reduction of energy, and allows them to invest and not feel like they have to front a lot of that cost up front. Our particular bill financing program allows like 0 to very low rates over a particular period of time. That makes it very attractive. If it needs to go for a longer period of time, it goes over 0%, but still it's much better than trying to front that cost in the front end. And so a lot of those pieces and those strategies with renewables, with bill financing options, being able to kind of meet those energy needs while still being able to decarbonize and work on planet health really is fundamentally it's fundamentally dependent on customer literacy and education and community impact and connect. I would say most utilities try to do that in some form or fashion. It's a little easier when you're right here locally and you're dealing with your footprint because you can speak the language and adjust your tactics based on the footprint that you have. So that's one of the values of, I would say, of public power, definitely municipal ownership, is that ability to have like that customized approach with the customer.
Fantastic. That makes a whole lot of sense. Now moving over to Matthew. So you just mentioned earlier that a lot of what motivated you to work on a public power campaign was this democratic aspect of it, putting more power back into people's control. What are some strategies that to ensure that a Muni is democratic and responsive to the demands and goals of the community? What types of ways can we structure these institutions in order to ensure that the people's voice are being heard?
Yeah, one of the major benefits of munis is that they're public entities, and for all the flaws of government, like they're going to be naturally more transparent, more accessible, more adjustable than any sort of private entity. So you obviously, just by the nature of having one, you have freedom of information laws, you have sunshine laws, you have transparency requirements, you have public hearings, you have public reporting that the public can have, and having strong watchdogs around the community they're actually observing and monitoring the utility for its performance is going to be critical to really maintaining that transparency and effectiveness for the public in the long run. From our perspective, and Brandy spoke to this a bit about in terms of how you would structure it, but one way you can do is structure the entire institution to be democratic and have a board that's directly elected by the people, as you see a lot of in Nebraska, for example. And you can that elected board can have its own series of public engagement, public hearings, and public input, along with periodic elections to replace or improve leadership if something happens. You need to hold the utility to account. It's also important, especially if you're talking about structuring or setting up a municipal utility for the first time, to really install a culture of service and culture of responsiveness into the utility. As anyone who's ever dealt with a bad investor-owned utility probably knows, a lot of private utilities do not have that. Kind of similar to but Brandy speaking to her experience in terms of customizing for the customer, that comes from a desire to actually serve and help your community. And it's important to build a municipal utility that sees itself as a public institution that's job is to serve the public. Because if you don't have that at kind of a foundational level, then even with all the other controls, transparency, the legal and political requirements and engagement, you won't get the same results. You'll be dragging the utility will drag its feet, and you'll have to drag along to get whatever you want. But it's important for having campaigns like Democratized ComEd, like Ann Arbor Public Power, to really advocate for having that and then serving as those watchdogs once it happens to ensure that culture and that service is maintained over the long run.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Matthew. And just before we go on to the next question, I just want to throw out, if there's anything that's occurring to you as our speakers are talking, you have a question at all, please feel free to throw it in the Q&A. We're about halfway through our prepared questions, and so we are very excited to be able to dig into any of the questions that you have. But moving on, George, you were kind of speaking to this a little bit before, but I'm curious, how accessible is renewable power on the market today? Is it generally more or less expensive than fossil fuel power for a Muni to purchase? And how do you expect that to change over time?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are a number of things going on in the industry right now. And let's talk about accessibility first and how easy or how difficult it is to get renewable energy built today. So up until maybe 2010, it was fairly easy to get a large project sited in Michigan. But as that's grown, you were encouraging or were encountering opposition at the local level. And specifically in the permitting process, which is making it harder and harder to get projects built. There are any number of developers, any number of companies, large, very huge ones and small developers that will do a project for you. They will look for property, they'll look for land on which to build a project. They will design a project, they'll build it, they'll operate it for you. There's no shortage of people that are willing to do that or entities that are willing to do that. But that's the easy part. Getting it sited and getting it built is a little bit more difficult. Just to give you a rough idea, at the end of 21 or 22, 2021, 2022, there was about 3,200 megawatts of wind energy in Michigan that was operating. Maybe 1,000 megawatts of solar, maybe 2,000 possibly, but you got about 5,000 megawatts, maybe a little less than that, of renewable energy in the state. Detroit Edison wants to build 15,000. At least that's what they put into their IRP, their Integrated Resource Plan with Public Service Commission back in November. That'd be 15,000 by 2040. Consumers wants to build 8,000 megawatts of solar. So there's a lot of plans for building. Whether you can get it all done in the permitting or not is a tough question. To me, it doesn't look like it's really doable here in this state right now, unless some changes are made to the permitting process. On the flip side of that, the good side of that, is that Michigan exists within the footprint of the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, which is the regional transmission organization. That organization stretches from Manitoba to Louisiana. It's huge. It's 15 states, one province. There are 45 million people that live in its footprint. It's responsible for the movement of high voltage transmission through that region, including into Michigan. One of its key responsibilities is transmission planning. And one of the plans that it has adopted, tranche one of that plan, is a $10 billion project that involves building a 345,000 kV sort of line backbone system from mid-Iowa, where wind is very strong, through Illinois, Indiana, into Michigan. So it may be that some of that renewables come from out of state. Maybe a lot of it come from out of state if permitting continues to be difficult here. In terms of pricing, prices, of course, have been falling right along for renewable energy, especially for solar projects. And they continue to fall, but for a couple of things. And one was the 30% tariff that the Trump administration placed on solar products. And the other is the, I'm not sure what I would call it, the sequestering of material coming from parts of China over that issue regarding Uyghurs and the west side of China, I think. Anyways, that has disrupted the market and created sort of a shortage of solar products here in the United States, especially for larger scale projects. Other than that, yeah, the price is falling. If I were to compare it with a traditional sort of generation, a thermal generator like a natural gas plant or a coal plant, what I would find is that, yeah, it looks cheaper. But I want you to think about it in terms of three projects, and it gets a little bit more difficult. We like to think of generation as being made up of energy. So this is the flow of electricity over time, continuously over time. We categorize that, or you get billed for that, as a kilowatt hour. We also think of another product as capacity. That's the ability to generate power at any moment in time, to be ready to replace power if there's a unit that gets knocked off of line somewhere, or if demand increases or weather changes. You have to be able to respond immediately, and that's capacity. And then there are ancillary services. Ancillary services are essential for reliability as well. So that's like load following. Supply must meet demand moment to moment all the time. Reserves includes reactive power, all those things. Now, when you look at energy, yeah, it's a lot cheaper. Renewable energy is cheaper. If you took the fixed cost, it's all fixed cost. If you took the fixed cost and you allocated it over production, you'd find that that's less expensive. But you wouldn't get much capacity. It has a shortage of capacity. So capacity value of solar is maybe 50% of the generating capacity of that unit. For wind, it's maybe 15%. So you'd have to replace the capacity somehow, and that cost would have to be entered into that calculation as well. And then finally, it may or may not be useful for ancillary services. As a result, it's a little more complicated. So really, utilities today, planners undertake a process called integrated resource planning, in which they combine all those elements along with all the resources and the characteristics of those resources to figure out what is the lowest cost. Typically, there are other constraints in the planning process as well, such as emissions. Some planning processes might use a carbon tax or a carbon expense to try to equalize the impact of the various resources. So it tends to be a little bit more complicated. However, most utilities are finding that building out their renewable energy at a very fast pace is cost effective and as well as helps manage future risks. So yeah, it's going to be playing a larger part, no doubt about it.
Well, that's hopeful to hear. Thank you so much, George. All right, moving back to Brandy. So Brandy, as the executive director of a municipal utility, how do you stay responsive to the concerns of the customers that you serve?
So I'm going to dovetail a little bit about the integrated resource planning that George was referring to. Right now, currently, we're actually referring to it as a climate action plan. The only difference is that there are some strategies that we're trying to implement technology-wise, and so we want to start doing some program development alongside of that integrated resource planning. And so probably the key piece that's one of the most valuable aspects of the integrated resource planning is the stakeholder engagement process. So it's an opportunity to connect with your customers, check in with them, let them get a sense of, like George talked about, the load planning, like what is the energy needs for your customers. It's a good opportunity to make certain you kind of know what's going on in your area. So being able to do that type of integrated resource planning at the local level allows us to really focus, and especially with the stakeholder engagement. So for us, it's a matter of definitely doing some surveys, which allows for a quantitative way of getting some input, but also being able to sit down with customers, have some discussion, have focus groups. And it really allows us to get an opportunity of, I would say, tackling 6 major goals when it comes to that stakeholder engagement process. At least that's our 6 major goals. And a couple of those, just off the top of my head, one deals with transparency of process, given an opportunity for the customers to understand, like, this is part of our process. This is why we're doing what we're doing. This is what's involved in it. Being able to get some industry insight assessment, meaning how informed are our customers in terms of what's going on in the industry. And what that does is it gives us an identification to figure out, like, what that perspective is that we need to kind of tackle. And then the other side of that with the opportunity is, getting a sense to ensure that we have our perspectives aligned. So if our customers have personal needs, we can start factoring that into our planning, whether it be in that portfolio mix, that rate design, those program integrations, being able to look for opportunities. Georgia kind of recall this, I think during the integrated resource planning that we did, and down in Lansing, we were able to identify a microgrid opportunity. And it wasn't something we were looking for, but it just, going through that stakeholder engagement process allowed us to identify those opportunities to be able to do that. And I really identify those partnerships. And that's part of the goal of that stakeholder engagement. And I would say that is probably the best way to stay connected with the customers, is to continue to have those opportunities, because the customers on a day-to-day basis, whether they are living in their homes, functioning with a job, raising a family, or they're a commercial customer operating a business, they're really focused on their needs right then. Unless your utility or us, we're not reaching out to you, they don't know what's available. And so being able to be more proactive and kind of reach out is one particular way. But I would really kind of be remiss if I didn't kind of touch on something that Matthew had mentioned, and it is one of the other values of public power is the opportunity to show up locally to those public meetings, give public comment. Definitely, you know, the sunshine laws of a FOIA request are great because you get documents, but the opportunity of being able to show up at a meeting and be present is that you're right there. You can see what's transpiring. Those people that are around that table, your utility board, live in the community with you. They speak your language. They can understand the needs. And while they may not necessarily be a utility expert, to some extent is an advantage, they know how to translate. And so that's kind of one of the best ways also to kind of stay connected, or we utilize it as a good resource.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brandy. Now moving over to Matthew, kind of taking a step back from a little bit more of the fantastic technical information that we've been getting from Brandy and George, and thinking more about kind of the campaign for public power. So you've obviously been waging your campaign for a lot longer than we have. And I'm curious, you know, what kind of difficulties did you run into facing taking on your campaign? What did you learn from it, and what kind of advice do you have for us here in Ann Arbor as we're pursuing the same sort of campaign?
Yeah, many. But you know, the nature of any sort of like political campaign, right, is you run into obstacles and barriers, and you have to figure out how to overcome them, however you may. To, I guess, break it down a bit, the types of kind of obstacles we face kind of really boil down to your political obstacles with kind of your elected officials and elected entities, your legal obstacles with the letter of the law, and then your public obstacles with the members of the general public and how you engage with them. On the legal side, because that's the simplest in our case, this will vary state by state, and I'm not super familiar with Michigan law on this. But thankfully in Illinois, every home rule municipality has an innate right to municipalize any of their utilities at any time without kind of precondition. But that's not true of in many, if not most states. It varies quite a bit. Like in Minnesota, for example, you have to pay them 10 years worth of revenue in order to municipalize on top of the value of the assets, which makes it very difficult to do there. But thankfully that wasn't a huge barrier for us, but we had to figure out the law to start off with, just to know what it was, because coming from a group of people who were by and large not utility experts, we had to very quickly become utility experts. I probably should put that first. That's really kind of number one thing you have to do in these type of campaigns. You have to learn how the energy system works, how utilities work, what, like, to reference some of the terms they brought up, what an RTO is, what like an IRP is, like what a PPP is, like how all these things work and interact with the utility, and how it would fit into the plan that you're developing for your future municipal power in your city. Because you really do need to come forward with a plan in these type of campaigns, in my view, because that really helps cement your vision as kind of the center of the debate, not just as one option among many, but really one of the struggles of our campaign, one of the goals of it was really to establish the debate as municipalization or something else, not make municipalization some also ran or some third or fourth option, but really the option, or you can come up with something better. And that really gets to the political difficulties of the campaign. Every city or state will have different politics and different political arrangements. I'm in Chicago. I'm sure everyone knows their Chicago stories about corruption and rough and tumble politics. It's both more true and less true than you think. But we faced a mayor who essentially said no right out the gate without any consideration. A city council that was just largely disinterested in the idea because as a body, they just aren't super interested in legislating generally, really, which is a very uniquely Chicago problem, hopefully. And we faced just general skepticism from them all about, like, how will this work? How much will it cost? What would it take? A lot of just general, we can't do this kind of defeatism from the get-go, oftentimes before they even thought about the issue at all. And that leads kind of to the public aspect of it, where really you have to win these type of campaigns. You have to win support of the public. You have to get people out, calling their elected officials, coming to events, learning about the issue, to really move them and demonstrate that there is clear and abiding public support for municipalization to actually make it happen. But in the same way, we as members of the campaign had to educate ourselves on utilities. The members of the public are not experts on utilities. Most people probably don't even know what municipalization is or what that word even means. That was one of the funnier things that happened when we first started the campaign. People would be like, what does that mean? Or in our case, we also use the word democratization a lot, also where we have to explain. So it's really about that public education element, like we have a monthly series of one-on-ones, for example, where we explain like the basis of the energy system from the ground up and how that fits into our campaign and what we want to do. It means having, big, more deep dives, panels like this, really making your campaign available and accessible to members of the public to learn more if they choose to. But also as a campaign, you need to be able to take all this vast amount of information about how energy in America works, essentially, and boil it down to what people need to know and want to know and relate that to their everyday lives. So like, how does, say, like a PPP impact your energy bill, for example? How does your local utility make money, and how are you paying for that? And like, what does that money actually go to? So understanding how, rate cases work, but boiling that down, say like, this is a rate case, this is how it changes your bill, and this is how much of your bill goes out in shareholder profits in the form of dividends and buybacks, and like really making that really clear to people, because that kind of granular connection to their everyday lives, that's really going to gain you that public support. And over the years, as we've been doing all this work, building all this knowledge, educating the public, engaging with elected officials, it's been, we clearly haven't municipalized yet, but we're getting there. But it's kind of an ongoing saga. It's always going to be for these campaigns. I think the average for municipalization campaign to be successful is like 5 to 7 years. So it's never going to be like a short endeavor, unfortunately, even when municipalization is the right answer. And it's pretty easy to determine if it's the correct answer for your city, because we're all here for a reason, and I think I can say that municipalization is pretty much always the right answer. But even if you have that, it's the winning public support, winning political support, overcoming obstacles from your incumbent utility or other special interests who would oppose the maneuver, and also just maintaining your own campaign through that with a large, active volunteer base and coalition of organizations that are really fighting for it. Pulling that together is, I guess, the challenge. It's just kind of, one ongoing saga of difficulties, but worthwhile saga, and, you can overcome the difficulties as you move along.
Fantastic answer. Thank you so much, Matthew. And now that we've taken a trip out of the more in-depth technical stuff, I want to dive us right back into it, moving back over to George. You've spoken to a lot of this already, but more specifically, just kind of what options exactly do munis have for renewable energy generation if they choose to pursue them?
Yeah, they have a number of options, and maybe helpful to think about these in 2 types of categories. One is local, and the other is remote, utility scale. So local, a lot of communities have done this, right? So they maybe have encouraged net metering, which is having customers put meters on put solar panels on their house, and then they're metered with the net amount of power that they actually use, and they're usually credited with power that they send back onto the grid. You can encourage that through various tariffs or other incentives. Brandy had mentioned the microgrid that we had worked on there, and the Lansing Board of Water and Light really Brandy was a leader on this. That included for this small area both some solar panels as well as batteries for resiliency. So it's an experiment in unloading maybe congested distribution plant, for example, distribution systems, and building some resiliency, and more expensive than what you would call utility scale generation, but very much localized and contributing more to resiliency of the system, the distribution system. At Lansing, we did a solar garden. So this was having somebody build, wasn't huge, but it was 150 kilowatt solar array. And our customers could then rent those panels, and any energy coming off those would be used to net against their bill. So they didn't have to have the panels on their house. They could rent them at another location. So those are things that you can do locally. And there's a benefit to doing these things locally because it kind of energizes the community, and frankly, to address emissions and climate change, energy is just one aspect of it. and getting the community involved and getting them aware of that is a benefit as well, and something that's going to happen to really address climate change in a serious way. The other category is the utility scale. That is a large facility. So there's a large facility, for example, and I think it's in Shiawassee County, that the Lansing Board, many municipals throughout the state are involved with 250 megawatts. So it's a fairly large array, 270 megawatts, maybe the largest one in Michigan, the largest solar array. So you can take part in something like that. You can do that through an organization like the Michigan Public Power Agency. There are other organizations. Wolverine Power Supply would probably be another agency that you could turn to for power through a purchase power agreement. So opportunities through purchase power agreements. You can build, if you so happen to want to build, you can build a facility yourself. Again, this requires some expertise to be done right, but you can do that. Benefit is that after the purchase power agreement is over, or after the purchase power agreement is over, after PPA, ownership of it always becomes an issue on whether or not you buy out the developer or not. Well, if you build, you own it no matter what. So you could build as well. You can go through private developers. There are some very large companies out there that will do that for you. So a lot of options depending on how you want to go. You can go with wind if you can think you can get it sited. You can go with solar. There is from time to time some hydro available in Michigan if you're so inclined to do that. Not the most, tends to be a little bit more expensive maybe. And there are issues with hydro as well. So, but there's some of that available. So yeah, there's a lot. And I would add that if as you think about renewable energy, remember you can always help manage the amount that you need, and that is through your energy efficiency programs. So always beneficial to try to save as much as you can first. That is cost effective, and then go to renewables.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you so much, George. And that kind of concludes the prepared questions segment of our roundtable tonight. So now we'll be moving into a Q&A. Some of these questions are addressed directly to different panelists and some are more open-ended. I want to encourage all of you to feel free to chime in if you have something to add to this. I might start it off asking somebody, but if you have more to add after they're finished, feel free to continue answering. And for the audience, please definitely do submit your questions in. We've got 4 fantastic ones to start, but I suspect we'll have time to get to more than that. So definitely want to hear from you. But starting off here with our first question, we've got an Ann Arbor transplant from Boulder, Colorado. Boulder, Colorado famously went through quite long and hard-fought municipalization campaign. And Peter is saying the anti-municipalization group in Boulder used to argue that successful municipally owned utilities were started from the ground up decades or centuries ago. Certainly that's true here in Michigan, and not by taking over existing utility infrastructure. How do you generally address the naysayer argument when it comes to municipalization? And Matthew, I think that if maybe you could kick us off here, at least on this one.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Boulder, was it 16-year saga of trying to municipalize? But yeah, I think first I just have to say, like, almost, I mean, the questioner says it's from an anti-municipalization group, but these questions are almost always asked in bad faith. They're almost always asked, and always asked on the basis of the idea that city government can't accomplish anything, essentially, is what they're implying in these questions, in almost all cases. And the way you respond is essentially refute that. It's like, no, like government is actually capable of doing things. You can remind them that your local city government is probably already running multiple complex services. Like they're probably already running their water and sewage system, which is also utility, also has large infrastructure footprint with potentially hundreds, if not thousands of employees. It's running other large departments, everything from like your family services department to your transportation department. If you have a local like public transit system, it's running that. So city government is perfectly capable of running these type of large projects. So the idea that they can't do it is simply just like false based on the evidence. You can insert that. Second thing you can say is remind them that like you're essentially buying an existing company, and acquisitions happen all the time. The fact that the acquirer is a city or state government does not fundamentally change that it's just an acquisition. Companies or investors that don't know anything about the industry they're buying into can buy a company and run it perfectly fine, right? There's no reason a city can't not do the same. And it's also important to note that in most cases of mutualization, like the employees and the facilities will often come with the assets as like an additional part of the purchase. So it's not like you're just getting like a bunch of wires but nothing to run them with and have to build it from scratch. Even if you could if you wanted to, mind you, but you don't necessarily have to in most of these cases. So you're getting a more or less intact company when you're doing this. And the third thing that I would say you can mention is, at the end of the day, running these type of businesses is essentially a function of money. And as long as you have the money to make the acquisition, regardless of what you're starting with, even if you want to start a utility from scratch, if you have the money to do it, you can do it. You can pay for the consultants, you can hire the people, you can install the infrastructure. And the nice thing about electric utilities, or really utilities writ large, is that they're all profitable. And in particular, they're profitable like by law. So essentially any way you run it, like hopefully you won't run it poorly, but even if you did, you could still run it profitably and make back your costs. So it's very difficult to truly like do this poorly in general. It's also essentially impossible for it to not be done. Any municipality can do it. Now, there's still clearly management operational failings that can occur. I'm not going to like pretend like it's going to be all, you know, unicorns and rainbows every conceivable time, but that's a separate problem from being able to do it in the first place. And there's ways to mitigate for those potential managerial operational failures, and also just hire good managers to make sure that that doesn't happen. So that's generally how we respond to it. It generally works. Now, if you give that answer and people still say, I don't think this is possible, they're just never going to support it in general. So you just kind of have to navigate around them. We do see that a lot as well. But really breaking it down like real world terms of like, it's like a corporate acquisition, it's like the water department, it's like whatever, really does bring it down to earth for like the people who are actually able to be convinced in order to convey that answer.
Makes a ton of sense. Anything to add from Brandy or George?
I can add a perspective or just a nuance there. And I'm not familiar with, you know, the laws and everything in Colorado, so to speak. So kind of keep that in mind. But one thing I would just want to share and just to kind of keep in mind is that municipal utilities and investor-owned utilities often do an exchange of territory. They enter into agreements where it can be mutually beneficial for you in terms of like service, you know, provided we work within, you know, the four corners of the law within the state of Michigan. So I, you know, seeing that as an obstacle, I can understand, especially from, I think, Matthew's perspective, if it's just a matter of figuring out how to buy out the assets and all that with the stranded costs and going through a lot of that heartache, so to speak. But I would just keep in mind that most municipal utilities have a decent relationship with their investor-owned utilities. So it's not impossible, I guess is my say. I mean, there's rules to guide on how that works. It's relatively structured. And so that doesn't really factor into a municipality's success.
It's great perspective there, Brandy. At the end of the day, it's business, right? Absolutely. So moving on to the next question, and this is for Brandy or George. So probably specifically for Brandy at the moment, though, George, I'm sure you have a lot of experience with that. Do your munis have MISO interconnections? And how does that work to supplement your power needs, including renewables?
So I would say, and George, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe almost every utility within the Midwest ISO has a connection. It's by law, you've got to be connected. There is this thing about electric reliability in the country. And so those agencies are there really for our reliability protections and planning. Each utility is a little different in terms of their relationship with their Midwest ISO and their transmission. I know Lansing was a little different than Traverse City, but we're what's considered a network customer for transmission. So, we get a lot of our transmission and our energy from that transmission line. What generation we do have, what we would call behind the meter outside of that, so to speak, might be some local solar, so to speak, or we would have customer owned generation, which will offset how much we take off of that network. We can offset that based on our customer owned generation. But otherwise, I would say that we're heavily reliant on it to meet our energy needs. How we procure our PPAs and our relationships and what we purchase through that allows us to kind of meet some of those renewable needs, like through those PPAs, because a lot of those go through those transmission agreements. And so I'm just reading the question a little bit clearly, see if I'm making sure I'm answering it okay. I would say right now it pretty much meets all our energy needs, but for what we would have from the customer or what we might have like locally, so to speak.
Yeah, so maybe I can add a little to it. So MISO is responsible for high voltage transmission throughout this region. And aside from controlling the transmission, it has a couple of other functions. One of those is to help effectuate that, it runs markets, energy markets. We all buy from those markets. The way it works is this. If you have generation, you typically bid it into that market every day. So you bid it in for every hour. This is what I've got available. This is what I want to bid in. This is my cost to run it. Everybody's doing it. Hundreds of generators are doing that all over the footprint. At the same time, if you're a load serving entity like a municipal utility, you're bidding in your load every hour for the next day ahead. MISO will then dispatch those generators from low cost to high cost to meet those loads as it's constrained by the transmission system. So the idea here is to operate the electrical grid over a large footprint as efficiently as possible, lowering the operating cost doing so. So most people want to take advantage of that and be interconnected. Yeah, everybody's interconnected. That's a load serving entity one way or another. And do that both for cost as well as for reliability purposes. So each load serving entity has a responsibility to have capacity, electric generating capacity, up to and exceeding its peak load with a margin of 8%. So 108% of its expected peak load for reliability purposes. And to help effectuate that, MISO has an energy auction or has a capacity auction every year. So that if you are in the footprint and you are a participant, like we all are, you can, if you don't have your capacity, you can try to purchase it in that auction to meet your reliability needs accordingly.
And we do all of that.
I believe it. Fantastic. Thank you for those really detailed answers. Moving on to the next question from Lauren. Just looking for generally, how do the provisions in the IRA make funding available for existing or new munis to provide renewable energy and energy efficiency to their communities? I'm not sure which one of you would like to start off on that.
I'll start it.
Yeah.
So until the IRA, the tax benefits of renewable energy were only available to tax-paying entities, and that changed with the IRA. So now it's available to non-tax entities like municipals and nonprofits as well. So what that does is it makes it a little bit more attractive if you want to build yourself. And you can either take it as a production tax credit, That is, you get the benefit as you produce power over time, or you can take it as an investment tax credit up front. Yeah, this lowers the cost, the net cost of constructing your own facility. That's what I see the benefit is.
The other thing I was adding, because I was peeking at that question. The government back in, I want to say a month or so ago, came out with its playbook for the IRA. It's called Building a Clean Energy Economy. I was trying to figure out a way to copy and paste that PDF here. I can maybe just send it to you separately, Greg. But it is, I would say, because there's so many grants out there right now, there's so many opportunities to find money to pay for clean energy projects, because we're all making these commitments to address the climate crisis. This playbook I thought was really good. It's very well organized, helps you kind of figure out like what applies to what, in plain language. So it's a resource that's out there. I'm gonna try to share it with you, and I think it's something that is very informative, especially for, I would say, the average homeowner, because it goes into a lot of detail in terms of what's available for energy efficiency, both on the gas as well as the electric perspective. How does cutting pollution, and how are you adding some resilience to the communities that you're serving as well? So it gives a lot of guidance. And so I would say the IRA not only made funding available, but it increased our knowledge base in terms of how to move forward with our climate goals.
Yeah, and Brandy, if you can remember, so I remember reading the provisions of the IRA some time ago now, so it's kind of foggy with me. But I think there were some additional benefits for municipal utilities like the Board of Water and Light and others, and that there were bonus incentives for where you site the facility. So if it was in a disadvantaged community, or a community in which there was an old coal plant or something, rehabilitation of certain areas, you could get benefits beyond the 30% credit. So that, that kind of fits maybe with the municipal's really strategy, goal, mission, all the more. I
agree. I think it definitely addresses that climate justice need, and definitely kind of incentivizes. I know there were a number of lobbying groups that were instrumental in trying to make certain that, these benefits aren't just available for those that have the biggest capital to invest, but there's a way to put them in areas where they ordinarily might not be, a target area, and to kind of incentivize that. I completely agree. I mean, I think it's it's a lot. It's a lot to bite, so to speak. But I think it definitely is an amazing opportunity for our generation right now.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. One of the great things about the IRA is as George mentioned, the equalization between public utilities and private utilities. That's been in the past kind of both a talking point and a true fact about the difference between the two. It's like you don't have access to these tax breaks. Well, that's no longer true. So from a competitive perspective, from a political perspective, from a financial perspective, it places communities in a much stronger position to invest heavily in generation in a way they didn't have before, which is why a lot of communities don't have a ton of generation because it just didn't have access to a lot of those benefits. A second thing about the IRA I'll point out is that it also provides funds for a bunch of not like direct electricity provision items, but things like home retrofits, decarbonization of appliances, things like that, smart thermostats, the whole 9 yards. And those are a lot of things that utilities can actually provide their customers as like a secondary business line, or through partnership with third companies to provide. And so if your Muni has a more comprehensive vision of decarbonization for its community, it could leverage those additional programs to provide funds for homeowners, for renters, for landlords, for business owners to decarbonize their buildings and their operations, but do it through the utility. So using rate-based financing combined with these tax credits to make this simple, easy, and from a single provider. And I think that's going to be hasn't been utilized too much yet, since it's still, the grant just got kind of announced in terms of their programming, but I'm excited to see how munis leverage that in the next 5 years to really like drive a lot of residential commercial decarbonization.
Fantastic answers from all three of you. Thank you so much for all that insight. And Brandy, definitely do send me over that guidebook, because an A2P2, I think we'll probably want to digest that and get that information out to our community. So moving on to the next question here. And you know, I can be understanding if you want to be a little careful with how you answer it. But, you know, generally for people who move into Traverse City and aren't used to experiencing public power, have you heard feedback and like differences and things that people enjoy about public power versus their investor-owned utility counterparts?
So I have not really. It doesn't mean that customers don't have opinions, and I won't at some point. Just a little background for what it's worth. I've been in this role since March of 2022. And then prior to that, I was at the Lansing Board of Water and Light for about close to 17 and a half years. And most of that was in a legal corporate compliance perspective as general counsel. And then I eventually actually took over George's job when George decided to move on. And so I would say in general, whenever I have kind of spoke with customers, especially if they're kind of regionally within the area, I think the biggest piece that they may kind of speak to is rates. The rates tend to be a little, I guess, a little different, at least from a residential perspective. From a commercial rate perspective, sometimes those bigger investor-owned utilities have that economy of scale leverage that makes it hard for me to compete with. And so that's the case here, even in Traverse City. You know, when we're dealing with commercial customers. But from a residential customer perspective, our customers tend to really like our service. They enjoy being able to, I get notes and letters all the time when they have an interaction with one of our staff people. I would also say, and I know this isn't really kind of the primary focus, but one of the pieces where we notice a big distinct difference from coming into our territory as a customer is when we take on a telecom customer, because that's a revenue generating opportunity that we started a couple years ago with TCLP fiber. And there's not a lot of diversity of other options up here. And so when customers come on, one of the things that they really like about it, and this is one of the things that we leverage for this business model, was they like the locality of it. They like the visibility, being able to have a local telecom provider is something that they saw value with. The reliability is great. The rates are great. And so for us, that's really probably where I've seen the I guess the biggest difference in feedback or observation.
Makes a ton of sense.
So
go ahead, George.
if I could just add an observation to that, obviously not from Traverse, but one of the things that you do see in municipal utilities is that the community is usually very supportive, and the utility itself is engaged in a number of social and cultural events in the community, and it builds that sort of support for it. Another big element of it is I think Matthew hit on this, is the transparency. So all the board members, you know, everybody knows who the board members are. Usually they're accessible to the members of the community. Their meetings are public, and the public has the right to attend them and to address the board. So it's something that you would never have in a privately owned utility.
Fantastic added perspective there. Thank you both so much for that fantastic answer. And moving on to our next question here. And if you have more questions, I definitely encourage you to drop them in here. Otherwise, we might be ending a little bit earlier than our scheduled end date, which isn't the end of the world. Has there been any discussion of the possibility of generating energy from wind turbines in the Great Lakes, particularly Lake Michigan or Lake Huron? And, you know, in your roles, have you looked into any projects like that?
No. I think I think I remember seeing one proposal once to put them in Tawas Bay, but it went nowhere. No,
Yeah,
that's kind of a no-go area, I think.
that's definitely a tough one up there. It's so unfortunate too, because Michigan has a really excellent wind profile. It's so much easier to get energy off of wind, despite the MISO accreditation for wind, than it is for solar up here. But I feel as if the siting and the control issues that we run into on land, and the fact that we really value our Great Lakes, it's like one of our one of our major assets here. People don't want to mess with them. So the idea of messing with our Great Lakes is just not attractive. Even though you can get enough energy, but to some extent, we have to kind of balance the ecosystem of what we really want to do as well.
I think it's a trade-off. The wind regimes are definitely better over the water than they are over the land. That's for sure. But I think maybe the other side of it is, as the transmission, as MISO builds out its transmission network, you maybe be bringing more of it in from the high plains, which is a pretty good wind regime itself out there. So that's probably more likely what you're going to see.
Yeah, there was a project that was explored in Illinois, Evanston, a suburb of Chicago. The big problems there, there was, as Randy mentioned, the kind of beauty of the lakes, impacting the lakes issue. But bigger issue was there were just, to George's point, there were no interconnections set up to have a large generation facility off the coast of a suburb. So you have to build that out. And then a secondary concern is that for these turbines, like the Great Lakes are pretty deep. They get up to I think 80 meters. In some spots, at least deep enough out when you install them. It's actually you have to have a lot of port infrastructure to build and deploy those turbines. So by comparison, like Cape Wind and all the new offshore wind projects on the East Coast, the only place they could find that had the right port infrastructure to provide for that up in the Northeast was in Louisiana, thanks to oil and gas and all the big deep water ports down there. And the Great Lakes just don't have that type of deep water port infrastructure that would be needed for offshore wind. You could build it, but between the interconnection costs, the port and development costs, and the fact that we could just build better interconnection to the Great Plains and build a bunch of wind turbines there, in my view, makes Great Lakes wind probably pretty unlikely to happen anytime soon. Maybe eventually with floating turbines, I could see it happening, but that's that's probably at least a decade away. And that's ignoring the kind of scenic issues that offshore wind runs into.
Yeah, and when you think about it, Greg, when you sit back and you think about it, up until now and really for the next few years, Michigan is a summer peaking utility. So loads are always higher in the summer than they are any other time of the year. So if you got to favor one or the other, maybe you balance, or you maybe want to build a little bit more solar energy. That does come on really towards the end of April, May, June, July, August, September, when you probably need it the most. There's a lot of resistance to wind in various places, so it just seems to maybe the fit seems to be better going with the solar rather than trying to go to wind in the water. It just doesn't seem to make sense right now.
That makes sense. I appreciate all of you with your insights into this. It's certainly something that I think it comes up quite often. I hear people wondering about wind power and its accessibility. So really appreciate you kind of digging into that. And kind of, I think speaking to George, what you were saying about how we're a summer peaking area, certainly I imagine that's true now, but maybe in the future that won't be true as we move more towards electrifying our heat. In particular, Lauren posted a question around Burlington, Vermont, which has a Muni, and they've already achieved their 100% energy goal, one of 6 in the nation that I'm aware of, which is fantastic. And they are working to help their community move off of carbon within their homes, electrify everything, and power it with renewable efficiency. What are some strategies that munis can use to help their community move towards that electrification goal that many climate-focused communities have?
So I'll start it off with one or two ideas here. So one is net metering. if you want to put solar panels on your house, solar gardens like we did at Lansing. So all those things can help the community and individuals in the community sort of try to decarbonize a little bit. So the largest emitter of carbon, greenhouse gases or carbon now in the United States is transportation, more so than energy at this point. So the other one is electrification of transportation. That's a big one, and a lot of communities are doing this, encouraging facilities for charging facilities. That's a big one that you can do. So when you start looking at carbon sources of carbon emissions, you come to electricity, you come to buildings, heating and cooling. So you come to transportation. So I think they're going into transportation now. That seems to be the easiest one. Buildings maybe eventually, but that's going to be a lot harder. You got a lot of retrofits there to do. And I think maybe you take one step at a time. You know, you go for the maybe the transportation next.
Makes a lot of sense. Brandy, do you have any ideas about how Muni could help with some of the electrification goals?
Just to kind of feed off George, I just add because I was reading the comment here, the question, and I think the strategy is, well, it is strategic and beneficial electrification. So being able, we have to get our customers, we say renewable ready, we got to get them electric ready. So we, so we can't expect to impact climate health and impact what our needs are and our goals if we don't try to influence consumer behavior, human behavior of consumption. We have a couple of customers within our service territory who are pretty much all electric. They are truly all electric. Some of them would say they probably have been off the grid, but it's required them to make some behavioral changes in how they just normally do things. And so the biggest piece that can be beneficial, I would say, and strategic, is being able to help that customer with being electric ready. Because otherwise, if they're not changing how they're cooking, having the lights on everywhere, I mean, it may seem relatively small, but it all really does add up. We're never going to accomplish that goal. All we're going to do is increase our energy consumption, and then we'll have to produce more power to meet that need. Or more specifically, it might end up being a much more expensive endeavor for the customer. So I always get a little anxious sometimes when I see the electrify everything as soon as possible, because unless we change how we do things, it's not going to accomplish our goal. We really need to reflect on, how we're living, how we're consuming. And the best way, I think, for us as utilities, what we can do is just educate the customer on some strategies. I mean, that's the reason why energy efficiency was a thing. It did lower bills, but really the reason why it was a thing was because we wanted to reduce the amount of energy you needed so that you can make effective those renewables. And so now we're at a point where we want to electrify everything. And don't get me wrong, totally love electricity, but we really need to bring the customers along and making them ready for it.
Yeah, and I'll just underline everything Brandy and George just said. Like, the role of munis is really to prep customers for that electrification journey and reduce their energy usage overall. Because especially in smaller munis that maybe be only a single town or a single city, you're not going to have a lot of space for generation locally. So there's limits to that. Although if you can maximize the net metering, the rooftop solar, all of that's a great route for local generation. The other generation thing I'll throw out is you've seen this historically like coal plants, but munis do have the opportunity to engage in co-investment for generation projects outside their service territory. So wind farms, solar farms, whatever, geothermal, whatever you want to do. That can be a key strategy for your muni in terms of actually figure out how to generate electricity in addition to just saving it. Of course, if you're a bigger muni, or if you're talking about, in some cases, we're looking at statewide utilities, that's when the options for generation get much wider for you. Like in Maine, they're pursuing a statewide utility and they'll have tons of generation options.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. And getting into the next question here. And so this is kind of another one of those, questions about countering some of the arguments that you hear against municipalization. Low capacity and analysis, load projection and analysis, something that DTE claims it can do much more expertly and efficiently than munis. How do your communities do it? How well do you do it? And, basically, are munis competitive with the big guys on some of this load planning type of work?
So George, you want to take that? Because, I feel like I'm biased a little bit. I can add, but you can definitely add a perspective from, so I think your knowledge of smaller utilities.
Well, I'm not sure what Detroit Edison meant, honestly. I see the question there, but I'm not sure what the original point that Edison was trying to make, or DTE was trying to make. So what I can say is this: we use a lot of the same tools. Forecasting is done pretty much the same way. If he's talking about generation planning, it's pretty much done the same way. Cost of service studies are pretty much using the same type of software, same type of analysis. There's give and take on this. So the DTE, large utilities generally have a lot of resources. They hire a lot of consultants. They have a lot of resources. They have a lot of scale economies in a lot of what they do. But they're not nearly as nimble as a municipal utility. Now, I was at the Public Service Commission for 30 years. I've done just about every electric rate case that was done over that period of time. I interacted a whole lot with the electric utilities. And so, I feel fairly comfortable saying we use a lot of the same tools. We do things pretty much similar. Municipal utilities are just more agile. They can be more nimble. So that's about all I can add to this thing, because I'm not sure exactly what DTE was getting at, or what the real point is here.
And then I would say, so for, I do know from my municipal utility experience, it definitely was not a shortcoming at all. But perhaps for even smaller utilities that maybe have more limited resources, they still have the opportunity to hire consultants or lean on their joint action agencies for support. So it happens, to George's point, and we're all using the same tools and the same resources. I want to say it is rocket science, but it's becoming less and less complicated these days.
Yeah, and another kind of, I guess, technical solution to this question, like, I think I agree with Brandon and George. I think communities are equally capable as large IOUs to do this work. It's honestly just, at the end of the day, it's doing some math, and like everyone can do math, and you can hire in like at least 5 people to do the math for you. And at the end of the day, if you're a small enough utility, that's probably enough. But nowadays you can actually, and this kind of segues to the last question a bit, now we have energy storage solutions. So munis or utilities, even very small ones, can manage their own load in a way that wasn't possible before. You could invest in local energy storage, so most likely battery storage, but you could do any solution that you wanted, even like gravity storage, which is very funny to me personally, and essentially solve your load problem for yourself. Potentially in a very extreme case, you could even go like borderline off the interconnection, just store all your own energy. Would not recommend that from a energy management perspective, but you could do it if you were really intent on doing it. But thanks to storage, a lot of these load concerns are becoming much easier to handle going forward. So that's also just something to keep in mind.
Fair enough. Thank you all so much. And also just a little bit of a disclaimer here. I have no evidence that DTE has said this. Is just phrased within the question. They certainly might have, but I can't verify that. All right. And our next question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jim.
It's kind of an odd point there. I'm wondering if there's more to it than that. But anyways, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no worries. So this is getting over to reliability. Over in Ann Arbor, we experienced pretty frequent outages. Just yesterday we had a pretty big outage. Can you speak a little bit, any one of you really, to how munis keep the lights on. What type of reliability advantages do they maybe have? And just kind of what work goes into making sure that power stays reliable. We've talked a lot about load, but also just in terms of keeping the lines up and functional, right?
So for us, because our footprint isn't like the entire state, we can respond faster. I mean, and then when we make our investments in terms of, line resilience, my God, it's snowing out there for real. Line resilience, poles, things like that. It's a smaller piece that we're looking at. Even if we are expanding outside of because we do have service outside of our corporate city limits, and those surrounding townships, it's still smaller than probably what your utility has to tend to right now for you, so to speak.
One of the advantages that municipal utilities have is they do have a more concise service territory. So that does help quite a bit. One of the things that the municipal utilities in this state have done is to put together sort of a joint agreement on assistance, so that if there's a major outage that requires more resources than a municipal might have, they can draw on other municipals around them to help support their own staff, getting additional linemen out there. Back in 2013, the Lansing Board of Water and Light experienced one of those 1 in a century ice storms that took down most of the system. And I've got to tell you, when you face the community under those circumstances, you never want to do it again. And so what that did was it sort of launched the Board of Water and Light on a 5-year tree trimming program. Most distribution outages are due to trees, frankly. And so what it has done, and it has improved its reliability considerably. Not wanting to fear the wrath of the public again, it has sort of maintained its 5-year tree trimming cycle. And that's really the community input and the response to it. So it has improved reliability.
Yeah, and to George's point, I think nationwide, one thing that's really sets communities apart is their commitment to service, and the way that IOUs just don't necessarily have to have in many cases. They have the public to face. They don't have kind of any sort of profit incentive to balance out, oh, maybe we should spend less money on this so we can make more money type of thing. And that really just that difference in priorities really drives that difference in service. And that's why I think generally across the country, the statistics say that munis and publicly owned power agencies generally have fewer blackouts, fewer service outages in general. And that's just kind of, again, the benefits of being publicly owned.
Fantastic. Thank you all. And this very well might be our last question. Maybe if we're quick, we can get one more in if another one is submitted here. But and I'm gonna broaden this question a little bit here. There's been a lot of discussion about the different agreements that municipal utilities have across the state with each other to be able to help out. What types of ways are munis able to help and cooperate with their neighbors, whether they are their IOU served neighbors next door or their municipal utility neighbors across the state and country?
So for us, George mentioned those mutual aid agreements. That is definitely one particular piece. I think from a state, local area perspective, there are joint action agencies where we all kind of collaborate and kind of share our needs and what we have going on. It also allows us to kind of supplement where we're short on services and resources, and whether that might be a Michigan Public Power Agency, MMEA, Michigan Municipal Electric Association. And I'd even go as far as to say, George, you're probably more familiar. I think Wolverine as well is one. And so, being able to connect with other municipals is really great. Up north up here, I would say there's also a really great partnership with our co-op utilities. They're still publicly owned. They probably say they're the original municipal power or public power here. And they're really great partners as well. I mean, they kind of surround my service territory, and we do look for opportunities to collaborate where we need. I mean, right now I can tell you, like we have a call center, or not a call, but a control system center where we have employees that are on staff. I mean, actually it's net door over there, and they're monitoring our system, they're taking calls. And then at like a certain time, it clicks over and Great Lakes Energy will take over for us, which is a co-op. And so we have relationship and agreements that just kind of support one another. We're talking. I would say I love this about the municipal power community, even at the national level with American Public Power Association. We love to talk to each other and share information and share resources. When we were all dealing with the supply chain issues with transformers, we tried to come up with like a pool to kind of figure out like, okay, like who has what, who can share this, and how can we ship it with one another. So we try to stay in consistent communication, because we feel like the strength of our, kind of the strength and the value is our connection with one another.
Fantastic. Well, I think that we are nearing our scheduled end here. So I want to thank, first of all, Brandy, Matthew, and George. Thank you so much for all of your expertise that you've given us. I think that these are some fantastic answers and just a ton for us all to kind of chew on and digest as we're looking towards the future of having our own public power utility here locally. So I really appreciate that. I also appreciate everybody who attended. Thank you all so much for your fantastic questions. If you want to learn more about Ann Arbor for Public Power, you can visit us at our website, annarborpublicpower.org. You can find us on all the different social medias, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, A2 Public Power. This will be available on our YouTube, Ann Arbor for Public Power. And we'll, if you want to stay updated with what we're doing, please consider signing up for our newsletter at our website. Other than that, just once again, thank you all so much for attending. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your night. And yeah, thank you.